coming with guns, cannons. They're using the technological advancement that they have been able to achieve through the scientific revolution, through the Enlightenment, through all these different movements that were occurring at the time in the European lands. And there's this symbolic meeting point between the Muslim world and the European world at that moment in 1798. And what do you think happened? They were absolutely decimated, the Mamluk dynasty. Not the dynasty itself at that moment, but the army was completely destroyed. And it is said actually that Napoleon cried on that day when he saw the Mamluk warriors, this ancient dynasty. 700 years they were in Egypt, running on the battlefield with swords and shields. He started to cry and he said, this is the last time that anyone will be fighting battles like this. Why do I mention this point? It will become clear. Let's wind from 1798 to the early thousands and before that. What led up to that particular meeting point from both of the histories of these civilizations? So let's look at the European civilization first. In Europe, you have at the beginning the Catholic Church that was oppressing, or rather repressing, a lot of the sciences and the knowledge and a lot of the step learning that would be done in the European lands. And so Catholic Church almost had an authority over it, and they used to control knowledge and make sure that only select people could study the Bible, and they were very, very much keeping all that in. But when the Renaissance occurred and the Reformation, there was a kind of a religious reformation of Christianity, where people started to challenge the authority of the church. So you have the Protestant Reformation that occurred. And most of the day, in our times as well, in Australia and in North America, most of the Christians you'll see are Protestant Christians. And their main thing, forget the Pope figure, he's just a man like any other man. Who is he to be the one to say that this is the word of God? He's not appointed by God. We should just go back to the source of the Bible. So that type of thought. And so when that happened, there was no centralized authority of Christianity as much. And so you also started to have developments, not religious, but also in science. And so you had the Renaissance, and you had thinkers like Isaac Newton and whatnot, who started to develop in the field of mathematics, etc., etc., etc. And in fact, you had, of course, this progress that started to occur, and you had the invention of the printing press in Germany. The Germans were the first inventing the printing press. This was a very significant discovery, a very significant invention, because before that, how could you make copies of books? What would you have to do? You'd actually have to physically write it down, and that obviously takes time, and it limits the ability for ideas to spread. And when the ideas aren't spreading, then people aren't able to build on those ideas, and so you get stagnation. So develop the invention of the printing press in the 1400s. And then you had the mass production of books, mass production of knowledge throughout the European lands. And then this led to what is known as the Enlightenment era and the scientific revolution. So at this moment in time, by the way, the Renaissance, it was not an atheistic movement. It was just a movement that developed in all the different modern sciences. People still believed in God. Isaac Newton believed in God. However, the discoveries that they were making and the attitude that was starting to be developed was that of anti-almost organized religion. It was the idea that God exists, but we have these scientific laws, and this is the way that the universe works. And so you got this idea, which was much more rampant in the Enlightenment age a bit later, which is known as deism. Has anyone heard of deism? Who here has heard of deism? Deism. No? I haven't heard of it anymore. Okay. From the sisters, anyone heard of deism? Deism, so you have theism, atheism, and you have deism. Deism is the belief that God, some exists that created everything, but He's not involved in the world anymore. He doesn't send prophets, He doesn't send messengers. He set the laws in motion, so you have grandeur creation, so it makes sense why everything is so amazing, but He doesn't actually interact with human beings. There is no prophets that are. So you had this deism started to occur. So it wasn't atheism, it was deism. And so the Enlightenment started to happen. And in the Enlightenment, you have thinkers such as Descartes. You have thinkers and philosophers that start to take that idea of deism and start to be a bit more bold in it. And so you start to get this atheistic slant, so to speak, towards things. And it makes sense. First you say, God isn't involved in anything. And then once you get to a point where science is able to explain a lot of different things naturalistically, well, what do we need with the concept of God anyways? And so this is kind of where that atheism started to rise, but not as much at this point in time as you see now in the 21st century. So anyways, we're now at this point, 17th century Enlightenment time. At this time as well, you have secularism, liberalism, types of ideas that are starting to be developed by thinkers like John Locke, Rousseau, these types of figures who starts to expound political philosophies that liberate the monarchies that exist in the European lands that were very backwards and repressive and used religion a lot of times to suppress a lot of advancement and achievement. And so they said, look, we need to separate church and state. That's the only way that we can progress as a civilization. And so these thinkers started to develop the idea of democracy and things like that, and they started to be implemented in various parts of the European lands. European history. And then of course then you get French Revolution against the monarchy, and then you get Napoleon Bonaparte. And then now we see exactly what is leading up to that moment. So at that moment in time, they have progress. They have technological advancement, they have knowledge, they have a new way of governing people. They've liberated themselves from their dark pasts. And so actually when Napoleon came to Egypt, he didn't just come with an army. He came with a commission I don't want to say it in the French because my French is not very good at all, but basically the commission of arts and scientists. He came with geographers, he came with archaeologists, scientists, he came with linguists, he came with artists, he came with them all to Egypt. And when he was there, he said, we are here to liberate you from the repressive Mamluk dynasty, the backwards Mamluk dynasty, so that you can taste the fruits of modernity. And this sentiment still exists to this day. This idea that the West has to come to the Muslim lands in order to liberate them from the repressive environment that they're in. It still is going on to this day as well. When George Bush was going into Iraq, that was one of the things that was being mentioned about Saddam Hussein. We want to liberate them, give them democracy, give them the fruits of modernity that resulted from this history that I just outlined. By the way, this is a very generalized, summarized history of the European civilization from, the Renaissance up until now. Very, very, very generalized, very, very, very brief. That was from the European side. What about the Muslim side? What about the Islamic side? We know that at its birth, when Islam came to be, subhanAllah, it was a force to be reckoned with. And you have the Sahaba, literally the generation of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, knocking on the doors of the greatest civilization, conquering lands, defeating the Persian Empire, who was around for millennia. You have Salman al-Farsi, Salman al-Farsi, the Sahabi of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from the lands of Persia, searching for truth, wandering the earth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made vast, looking for the truth, finding it in Medina as a slave. SubhanAllah, in his lifetime, he goes back to Persia, but not as weak, not as a slave, as a conqueror. And he literally lived in the palace, the white palaces of Ctesiphon. SubhanAllah. This was the Islamic civilization, and then very early on, Islam was very open. Sorry, I shouldn't say Islam in the religion. The Muslim world was very open in regards to different ideas. And so they started to interact with Greek philosophy, translating the Greek writing and learning their different concepts. And you had debates and different things. And so, in this time, which was the idea of the golden age of Islam, the golden age of Islam, comparable to the Renaissance that occurred in the European lands, this was much earlier on, in the first 200 years, the Abbasid dynasty. So first you had the four Khulafa. Who are the four Khulafa? Started with Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman, then Ali. Very good. After this, you had, so these were the rightly guided caliphs. Now you had the Umayyad dynasty, which was from the Banu Umayyah of the Quraysh. And then you had the Abbasid dynasty from the Hashemite tribe, or from Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So during that dynasty, which is just 200, 300 years after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you had this golden age, you had this translation of Greek works, you had this advancement in science and in mathematics and in medicine. You had the Baytul Hikmah, the house of wisdom in Baghdad at the time. This is around that time. And so around this time, you not only had advancement in the dunyawi sciences, you also had advancement in the dini sciences. This is the time that you had the great four madhahib, the imams, the A'immah of Islam. Abu Hanifa, who are the four imams? Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, and Ahmed. When did they all die? So start with Imam Malik. 170 after the Hijrah. Imam Abu Hanifa, yeah, I forgot that. 150. 150 after the Hijrah. Yeah, Imam Abu Hanifa. That's CE. That's CE, 800. Yeah. 150. And then Imam Shafi'i, 204. And then Imam Ahmad, about 240. Anyways, I always find death dates really important because you don't know a scholar unless you know when they lived. Because their ideas, their thoughts were influenced by the environment that they're in. So you can quote this scholar, you don't know whether they're living, what's influencing their thought. So someone, for example, living during the time of Andalus, the golden days of Andalus, experiencing the blessings of multiculturalism and having the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews living together, going to have the same ideas about politics as a person like Imam al-Qurtubi, who was escaping the Inquisition of the Spanish Inquisition. They're going to have very different ideas about politics, and their views are going to be very different. So it's very, very important to contextualize a lot of their thought, especially when it comes to things that don't have to do with the ibadah, but things that have to do with mu'amalat, with interactions. In any case, so you have the dini as well, you can say Renaissance, or not you should say Renaissance, but you had the dini flourishing in the sense that you had all these sciences of Islam start to develop. Fiqh, hadith, aqidah and theology. Interestingly, as I mentioned earlier, Greek philosophy being translated, we talked about how this led to like a deism in the European lands. In Islam, you had a similar movement that started to occur. The Qadariyah denied it. They said, oh, Allah doesn't determine what happens in this world. Very similar to the idea of deism at the time of Europe. But the Qadariyah were very similar to the deists in that kind of Renaissance or post-Enlightenment or the Enlightenment time in the Europe. But what happened was, because you had the flourishing of the Islamic sciences as well, you had Muslim scholars and theologians debate the Qadariyah and be able to provide an alternative to that. So the Muslim world didn't become fully entrenched into these different thoughts and ideas. And so you have a lot of the different doubts and ideas about God and theology that occurred in the European lands earlier on. You find them and their debates and their discussions much earlier in the Muslim world. And so you have people like Imam Ahmad, who actually engaged with the ideas of the Qadariyah, of deism. So you have Imam Ahmad's response to deism, even though it was in the Western side a much later kind of popular thought. But in the Muslim world, these ideas were being encountered, and you had books being written about it, and refutations, etc., etc. So you have this going on for many centuries in Islam. Alhamdulillah, many centuries. And then you have, of course, later on, to the end basically of the 8th century after the Hijrah, which is around 1300, which is around the Renaissance period of Europe. That's when you start to see stagnation. You know, in the 8th century Hijri, you had scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, al-Dhahabi, Imam al-Shatibi, Ibn Kathir, these big names. The 9th century, you can hardly name a scholar that produced any original work that you can really say, wow, that's what's really interesting how they're building off of this. Ibn Hajar is often used. Ibn Hajar's main work, a commentary of Sahih Bukhari, is a compilation of what was said in the past, rather than putting forward any particular ideas. Imam al-Shatibi, he was the one that you see had a very clear conception of maqasid sharia, the goals and the objectives of the sharia of Islamic law. That was developed by Imam al-Shatibi. I mean, before him as well, Imam al-Juwayni, Imam al-Ghazali, even Imam Malik, you can say it started there. But in terms of it being very coherent theory, that was Imam al-Shatibi. After that, you don't have very much. You have a stagnation in almost all the Islamic sciences in the dini sense. And then you also have a stagnation in the dunyawi sense as well. Muslims are no longer engaging in advances in medicine and science and mathematics and all these different types of fields. What's the reason for that? Well, one interesting thing, because of this stagnation, one interesting thing people link it to this event. Remember I mentioned about the printing press that was invented in the 1400s by the Germans. The Muslims at the time said that this is actually haram. Printing presses are haram and we should not implement them in Muslim lands. For whatever reasons, and there's a lot of reasons to go into why they said that. Some of the reasons were legitimate, and in fact they were a real fear. So they said, look, if you mass produce these texts, anyone will be able to read anything. And then you will have it thinking that they're experts. And that will lots of corruption and problems. And subhanAllah, you have an issue here with the Google and Wikipedia and stuff. Especially in the field of medicine, a lot of doctors lament that when they went on Google and typed, he starts to debate with the doctor about the best treatment for him because Google, right? So, we understand that even for the Muslim world as well, a lot of shuyukh and imams, for instance, they also lament the fact that a lot of Muslims come asking for a fatwa, and then their opinion, and they say, oh, no, but this is this. It's like, why are you coming and asking me if you here and said this and you were fine with that? Why are you arguing with me now? So that was a real fear. There was also the idea as well. Anyway, there's a lot of different ideas, but it didn't keep it. They were not open. They weren't open to taking in that invention and benefiting from other civilizations. And so as a result, of course, when you look at the two civilizations side by side, the Europeans are going to advance in the dunyawi sense because they have the advantage of the printing press. They have this very strong advantage. And these ideas that are being spread in the European lands are not able to be spread in the Muslim lands because there's no printing press. This could be a blessing, you could say, because at the time, as I said, there was dini stagnation. There was not many original scholars of aqidah or theology that would be able to counteract the different ideas that were coming from the Renaissance, from the Enlightenment stage. And so maybe Allah protected the Muslim Ummah from that. Perhaps if these ideas were translated, you don't have the scholars to be able to respond, then you would have the same European trend of this atheism, secularism in the Muslim land as well. Allah Ta'ala alam, Allah knows best, qadr Allah ma sha fa'al, whatever Allah does is best. And so perhaps this was a blessing in disguise. But the fact of the matter is that the Muslim world in the dunya sense went down and in a dini sense went down. Both areas, stagnation. A very strong, and so at this moment in time, they now are meeting the Europeans for the first time, seeing with their own two eyes the result of modernity. And the term modernity, when I use this term modernity is basically the culture, the philosophy, the politics, the social environment that had changed after the Enlightenment. And so there are a lot of changes. Politically, democracy, liberalism, secularism. Culturally, a lot more permissive and moving away from Abrahamic morality. On a philosophical stance, a lot more skeptical, a lot more atheistic, or at least deistic. So these types of things, that's what we mean by modernity. And so the Muslims obviously are wary about modernity because it kind of goes against a lot of the different values of Islam. But for the first time, they're seeing the results of it firsthand. And so the Muslims, the Mamluk dynasty at the time, are completely, now we go back to this event, are completely destroyed by Napoleon Bonaparte's army. And that's when you have this shockwave that's sent throughout the Ummah that resulted in lots of different responses. So now you have modernity here, literally being forced down the throats of the Muslim world by gunpoint. It wasn't just France and Egypt, this was just a symbolic event that many historians point to. The first meeting point of the Muslim world in modernity was that battle. But obviously with the British Empire, all throughout the Muslim lands, in India, in Pakistan, you had of course the French in a lot of places in North Africa and Egypt as well. So, what was the response of the Muslim world at the time to the ideas of modernity? Keeping in mind, we do not have Ibn Taymiyyah's Imam al-Ghazali to be able to respond to the intellectual challenges that modernity is facing. We don't have the fuqaha, the great fuqaha, the genius fuqaha, to be able to start to deal with all the complexities of modern politics and the modern nation states that's coming. So, generally speaking, the Muslims responded in, you can say, let's say, one way, it's resistance. Absolute resistance to it. And it makes sense. Someone's forcing something down your throat at gunpoint, you're going to resist. Because not only are they forcing these ideas to change you, they're also dominating your political landscape as well. And so you're not going to be really happy about anything that they're going to be telling you. And so you have resistance. And this is where you have, throughout the Muslim lands, this very strong traditionalist focus of we need to turn a blind eye to everything that's happening around the world and focus on the tradition and go back to the texts. We need to focus just on the madhahib, stay on what scholars in the past said. And let's not think about any of these different ideas. And so these resistance movements, which were probably very important at the time, actually, because the other response was total assimilation. So you had people who completely left their Islamic identity and said, we need to embrace the value, the ideas of Western civilization. And so I'll use India as a case study because it's a really good case study to see different responses. So you had Muslims who were like that, who are kind of the quote-unquote puppet of the British Empire, but then had a very strong movement emerge within the Indian, Pakistani subcontinent area, and that was the Deoband movement. The Deoband movement, Deoband is an area, and there was a school that was there that resisted to Western colonization, not just, at that point, not really land, they couldn't do anything, but a cultural imperialism or a theological imperialism. They wanted to resist the ideas of people going to secularism, taking away Islam from the role in the public life, in the public sphere, or the role of Islam in their day-to-day interactions in life. And so the Deoband movement emerged, and their focus was on ensuring an Islamic culture was preserved. And so that's why to this day, in the Tabligh movement was very closely linked to the Deoband movement. The Tabligh Jamaat movement is not a scholarly tradition. The Deoband movement is a scholarly tradition. The Tabligh Jamaat movement came from that scholarly tradition, you can say. And their focus was to go to areas all throughout the Indian and Pakistani lands, visit Muslims door to door, individual basis, grassroots movement, talk to them, remind them about Allah, tell them to come to the masjid, to pray their salah. And there was also a strong focus on clothing, on eat, on the sunan, on the outward sunan. Why? Because who do you think is wearing clothes like this? The British. These are foreign clothes. So if a person starts to wear these clothes in British colonized India, it usually meant this person has don't really want it anymore at all. And so the focus was, no, we're going to wear what we used to wear. Because of course, thobes and these things, they were foreign to the Prophet ﷺ. This is not something that the Prophet used to wear, thobes and whatnot. This was something that we were at the time. So the Prophet ﷺ did, it was seen as something, this is what Muslims do as a culture, as a people. And we need to stick to our identity. And so you see to this day as well, the Deoband movement and Tabligh Jamaat, they're very focused on this aspect as well, of preserving that Muslim culture, Muslim identity, showing that you're a Muslim. You know, when you, subhanAllah, see any person from the Tabligh Jamaat, you know that's a Muslim. They show it, they wear their Islam on their sleeves. And they're not afraid to go out, and now they're going out the world, and they go to different areas and stuff, from that same mindset. But this is where it's stemming from. It is the resistance to effort. So now you can understand the history there. Now, that is the resistance. And then we talked about the assimilation where people just completely neglected it. In our times, fast forward to our times, now you have, in the last couple of decades, we're at a point in our ummah never before seen. Muslims are voluntarily going to Western lands. Western lands are not coming to their homes and pushing down these ideas down their throat. Muslims are going to the Western lands, looking for a better life, looking for a better life for their family. And for the first time, Muslims are willingly, voluntarily encountering these ideas, not in the setting of a gun, but in the setting of a pen and a notepad, or in our case, a laptop and an iPad, in the education system. They're going to schools, they're going to universities, and they're now in the classrooms, and they're being taught these ideas. And so now we have another action to this area now, and it's very new. This is very new. This is literally decades. We are now part of history. We are all part of history. How we respond to these ideas of modernity, of atheism, and how we respond to these challenges, this will be written in the books of history. How the first Muslims who moved to these lands interacted with modernity for the first time in a peaceful, non-adversarial way. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, subhanAllah, the times that we're living in. And so in our times, what you usually see now is different responses of living in the West. So one continues with the response from back home, because that was the response from back home. And so people, when they come back, they think we're going to keep how everything goes that same way. So you can call this traditionalism if you want, this very focused conservative traditionalist approach, which is, you know what? These ideas are very dangerous, and they are. We have our La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. We want to pray, fast, have our masajid, and that's enough for us. And close ourselves out to these different ideas. Let's not talk about it. We don't need to go into this. It's way too in-depth. No one's really qualified to do it, etc., etc., etc. And so you have this approach, stemming from the still resistance approach, the resistance mindset. Now, you have as well the violent resistance approach. This is very controversial. But you have, of course, stemming from this resistance approach, you have people who say, wait, intellectually, we should fight back. And so now you have these movements and whatnot that started to emerge in Egypt and in Saudi, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these types of things. They're coming from that mentality of non-resistance, but they took it to another level and they said, look, resist not just intellectually, but with our fists as well. And so those movements are actually responses to modernity. They're not coming, see, from non-Muslims' perspective, a lot of people, they have this conception, this is what Islam, this is the culmination of Islam, the epitome of Islam, these groups like ISIS and whatnot. Actually, historically, when you look at it, this is a reactionary movement to modernity. It's a reactionary movement to modernity, that they think that they need to deal with it in this particular way. So you have resistance, non-violent, and you have resistance violent. And by and large, resistance violent doesn't exist in the Western lands. You don't find people who are spreading these types of ideas in the Western lands. But you have a lot of people who have a non-violent resistance, and just says, let's just stay away from all these different ideas. That's one response. Another response is a progressive response. All these ideas, look at how better the Western world is compared to the Muslim world. Look at the progress, look at the achievement. We're coming here, we're leaving there. What has our understanding of Islam, this conservative traditional understanding of Islam, done for anybody? It's probably wrong and we need to update it. Not even update it, it was always wrong. And so they say, let's go assimilate and take all these ideas of secularism and liberalism, all these different things, and let's take them forward. And so they reject lots of different aspects of morality in the Quran. Drinking is okay, and everything is okay. The only thing of Islam is basically, worship God. That's all Islam is. And in fact, actually, some of them, like you have figures like Irshad Manji, I believe he's from Toronto, and Tariq Fatah as well, who is definitely from Toronto. They say things like Irshad Manji, for instance, he said once, oh, do you need to believe in the Prophet Muhammad to be a Muslim in your eyes? And she said, no, I don't think so. SubhanAllah. So Islam is really like, with this, it's just infinitely elastic. Anything. Islam becomes just a cultural label, and that's what they're making it. And in fact, as Imam was saying upstairs, there are forces at play that are trying to manipulate certain things. This is a big thing that's happening throughout the Western lands. The liberal American, I'm not too familiar with the politics in Australia to be able to comment on this, but for sure in America and Canada, the liberal governments compared to the conservative governments, they're very focused on trying to make an Islam from a religion to a cultural label. And so you'll see the way that they defend us, like, everyone's happy, they post, oh, Justin Trudeau, or what this person said, look at what this MP said, look at what this person said, look at what this Muslim person said from these liberal governments, and they say, look at how, this is the thing, we need to look deeper. Look at how they're defending us. Theology, or as a set of beliefs, it's that Islam is a culture. Islam is just an identity. It's just a culture. And it can encompass any belief under the sun. So they're trying to turn Islam from a theology, from a belief system, from a set of practices to just culture, a race that they can defend along with the other races. Why? So that they can get their support, the minority support for the government. So there's a lot more, it sounds very cynical, but there's a lot more at play in terms of their defending of Muslim rights. In any case, so that's one other response, the progressive response. Now you have recently, and I think this is a response that is needed, is the tajdeedi type of revivalistic movement that's starting to occur in Western lands, which is the idea of, look, we can't just block ourselves out from these ideas. We are living here, maybe we could, because we already grew up, we already have, we're just thinking now, but what about our children and our children's children? They're going to be exposed to these ideas constantly, and these ideas are evolving, they're not stable. We're way behind. I mean, what we're talking about in the 17th century, the enlightenment of secularism, that's 300 years ago for the West. They're talking about modernism, they're talking postmodernism now. So Islam is in a need to, very much in a catch-up need in terms of the tradition and in terms of the scholarship that needs to be produced. We can't just turn a blind eye to these ideas. In fact, they say, look at our history. Look at who we were. We weren't people that ever turned a blind eye to different ideas. We were always a people that would constantly recognize the intellectual superiority of Islam and be not afraid to interact and to confront the challenges in these ideas and these ideologies that challenge the basis fundamental of Islam, and using Tawheed and using the Quran and using the aql that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us to be able to respond and demonstrate the intellectual superiority of Islam. You know that very famous ayah in the Quran, لِيُظْهِرُهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ. SubhanAllah. So that Islam will reign supreme over all ways of life. Obviously there's talking about this in the sense that in terms of quantity of Muslims, but scholars also interpret this as meaning Islam is demonstrated as being buhur, it's being so clearly true over all other ways of life. This is a task that we all have to literally pick up. We have this, basically you can say, this buried tradition and this buried set of attitudes that we need to kind of take back out from the ground and run with it, and continue to run with it, and to be able to grow this rich scholarly tradition that we had left many, many centuries ago. And so this tajdeedi kind of effort, the idea that, you know, there's a revival, which is not a reformation, by the way. People talk about reformation of Islam. Revival is different. Reviving means it was fine, but then something happened to it and we need to bring it back. So that's the idea of reviving. And so the idea is we need to revive it. And so you have lots of scholars now who are starting to interact with, subhanAllah as well, our own Imam and Sheikh here, Imam Ahmad, is someone as well that I deeply admire and respect for his contribution to this particular effort. His master's dissertation was on responding to Orientalist critique of Sahih Bukhari, responding to these different types of things. And as well now, alhamdulillah, he's working on responding to different progressive movements and how they view the Quran and how they try to twist the Quran and whatnot. So this is an example of this new kind of effort that's being forged, which is this idea of we're going to study the tradition, we're going to understand our roots, try to defend orthodoxy, and we're going to confront these ideas, and we're going to do it in a way and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help to do it. We're going to do it in a way that is, you know, unbiased, in a way that's in a way that possesses academic integrity. It's not about just saying, oh, this is all wrong and we're going to prove it wrong. It's about examining each and every point and asking ourselves the question, perhaps our understanding of Islam is wrong and perhaps this one is right, and doing that constantly for everything. And some things can change in terms of our views towards things, and some things can become more strengthened. And this is the whole difficult effort is definitely required by scholars throughout the world. And this area of modernity and responding to these types of things is definitely an area that it requires great effort and it requires great foresight. And so what I mean by that is that when we want our young people to become scholars and ulama, for instance, we have many ulama that can go and they can study for a couple of years, learn the Quran and whatnot, and come back and just teach people Quran and whatnot. But we don't have many people who've studied properly these ideas from the Western perspective and then studied the Islamic side to be able to appropriately respond and produce appropriate, to basically contribute to that particular conversation. So this is really the point that we're at right now. Now, a history lesson, you thought this was about atheism. The reason why is I thought it was very important to understand why we're talking about this topic here today in the masjid. A lot of people say to me, why are we talking about atheism? We should talk about something iman boosting, you know, like a story of a prophet, or, you know, let's do some tafsir of Quran, etc., etc., etc. This is so vital. Topics like these are so important that something that, as I said, we are literally centuries behind in. And it's something that is so important for us to take on, for the sake of our children at least, so that they understand and they have an alternative that they can turn to and say, that's the Islamic way of looking at this particular issue. So this particular talk is not going to be talking about modernism and secularism and all those different types of issues and liberalism. It's going to be focusing on one aspect that is part of this modern world that we're living in, and that's atheist slant that we constantly see. This kind of atheistic, nihilistic view of the world that is very, very much common and widespread throughout, as we were mentioning, in the Muslim world as well, in the Western world. And a lot of Muslims, although they may cling on to their faith, they still doubt a lot of these different ideas. And inshallah ta'ala, we will be going into that. Awesome. That took a lot less time than I thought it would, so we have more time, alhamdulillah. So, inshallah, we're going to take a break at this point, but the break is going to have an activity bedded into it. Before I do that, I'll just give an outline of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to put the slides up. So the slides are basically going to be focusing on 4 main figures of atheism. 4 main figures of atheism. They're seeing how this thought has contributed to popular ideas now, and then responding to them as well. And so these 4 figures, Charles Darwin, and obviously the theory of evolution, Karl Marx, the father of communism, and the militant atheistic Soviet atheism that we saw in the 20th century, Friedrich Nietzsche. Who here has heard of Friedrich Nietzsche? Very good. He is the famous person who said, God is dead and we have killed him. And Sigmund as well. These are the 4 figures, inshallah, we're going to be exploring their thoughts on a general level and then responding to them. Because the reason why I wanted to do this rather than just say conceptually, these are the ideas and this is how I respond to atheism, is because I want everyone to recognize, and especially the young people to recognize, that this atheism is not some sudden realization that occurred because of our advancement in science. It has its own history, it has its own figures, it has its own cultural, social context in which it emerged from. And we're going to study where these thoughts come from exactly. Who are the people who started to espouse these types of thoughts? So inshallah, we're going to go into that. But first, I want to give you guys about a 15-minute break. But in the break, I want you to open up a Quran in your phone, or if you have a Mosque with you, or just think through your head if you're half of the know the Quran very well, and think about who was the atheist figure in the Quran. Who was the figure in the Quran that was an atheist? Because as remember I said atheism is nothing new. It's not. The Quran even references some forms of atheism, and there's a particular figure that was an atheist, a clear atheist. So think about that. Do we have prizes? Didn't bring them. Okay, so just glory and the honor of being able to answer, it will be good. And du'as. So yeah, so think about that inshallah, and we'll take that up after the break. So 15 minutes. If you guys have any questions, feel free to come and ask me. Alhamdulillah. I'll do it. That's fine, yeah. That's fine. That's good, yeah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, as-salatu was-salamu ala Rasulillah wa ba'd. All right, let's reconvene. Who was the atheist figure in the Quran? Atheist figure in the Quran. Some from the sisters. No thoughts at all. Crickets. Yes. Fir'aun? Okay. You were saying? That's disputed. Actually, it's not true because they were the Ashab al-Aika, which are the people of the tree. So they worship this tree. But what is said about them, some people say, is that they were secularists because they said, As-salatuka an ta'muruna. That does your prayer command us to how we deal with our wealth and everything like that? But they weren't atheists in the sense that they denied. Okay, so we have Fir'aun. Anyone else? Abu Jahl? No. Bani Israel were atheists? No, they were not atheists. And it said figure. Fir'aun is correct. Fir'aun is correct. Very good, mashallah. So Fir'aun is... Was it first? Liberal. How so? Oh, subhanAllah, I see, yeah. Yes, no, they're referenced in the Quran, but my question was the figure, one person. So the Dahriya were mentioned in the Quran about, we only die or live, وَلَا يُهْلِكُنَا إِلَّا الدَّهْرِ, right? But I'm talking about the figure who actually supposed to be atheist. So that was Fir'aun. Fir'aun said, أَنَا رَبُّكُمُ الْأَعْلَى. He said he is God, right? And in fact, when Musa alayhi salam was preaching about the Rabbul Alameen, he said, فَمَا رَبُّكُمْ يَا Musa? رَبُّكُمَا يَا Musa? Who is this Lord you're talking about? He didn't even know that this concept existed. SubhanAllah, that arrogance, right? He thought him being God explained everything. He didn't even think about, well then who created the sun? How did the whole universe get here? How did the cosmos get here? He was so self-centered, the arrogance. And then when he said, no, okay, this is the Rabb of this, and then he said, لَإِنِ اتَّخَذْتَ إِلَهًا غَيْرِي لَجَعَلْنَكَ مِنَ الْمَسْجُونِينَ. That if you are going to take a God other than me, we're going to imprison you. And so yes, Fir'aun was the atheist that's mentioned in the Quran, and as Imam Shaykh was mentioning as well. The Quran also responds to arguments of atheism. This thing is just really annoying, honestly. I really want to just chuck it. Is it bothering you guys as well, isn't it? The muffling is fine? Okay. It's just me then. I'll just deal with it. Okay. It's the antennas. Should I be wearing a tin foil then? Okay. So yeah, Fir'aun was the atheist figure in the Quran. The reason why I wanted to do that activity was to show that the Quran talks about atheism. So it's not something new that only came about post-Enlightenment Europe. It's definitely in its scale and its style. This is kind of a very unique kind of flavor of it. But it's not anything new. And the reason why I highlight that is because many atheists like to say, oh, atheism came as a result because of our scientific advancements and achievements, and we learned so much, and so then we realize there's no God. And if you don't, then you're just an absolute idiot. That's not true, because atheists existed from the time of the ancient Greeks, during the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and onwards as well. There were atheist figures. In fact, within Muslim civilization, there were figures that used to say, deny the nubuwwah of the Prophet. The Muslim philosophers, there's a class of Muslim philosophers, the falasifa, that the Muslims used to study. They're called Muslim philosophers. A lot of them denied God's existence externally, but said, oh, it's just basically a psychological thing that people believe in their head to cope with the difficulties of the world. Like people like Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, these types of figures, they had these weird types of ideas as well that you can say is very similar to modern day atheism. But you add people like Imam al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahumullah, who would respond, Imam al-Razi, they would respond to these types of criticisms and critiques. And you had that type of thing happening in the Muslim world. But it wasn't obviously to the scale as we're seeing today. So that's an important point to learn. Now, yes? A definition of atheism? Atheism is the belief that there is no God. And it's the absence of the divine. So there's nothing transcendent and there's no God that created or is involved in anything. Yeah. Fair enough, he thought he was a God. So really it's more the idea of the transcendent God. A God from beyond the world, you can say, that created everything. Because the Quran mentions about أَفْرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَى. Have you seen the one who has taken his own desires as a God? So Fir'aun was very self-aware in the sense that he didn't say, oh, I'm not taking my own desires as a God. He said, no, I am a God and I've taken my own desire. Like he fully embodied that idea. So he was still an atheist in the sense that he disbelieved in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But good point there. So before we go on, okay, so here you can see, why is this person's name here? That's not me. I stole these slides. Spiritual Perception is a blog site that myself and this person as well, who's my mentor and teacher, Sheikh Nazir Khan, who's also a doctor as well, he did this presentation in the States for Al-Maghrib Institute. And so he kindly allowed me to use his slides. So some things we're going to talk about are not really on his slides, but just for the 4 figures. They'll be very useful to go on. But I mentioned before as well, whenever I give these talks, spiritualperception.org is the website where you have a lot of these articles. He has 2 articles on the problem of evil on the Spiritual Perception website. I have an article on the psychology of doubt, which is the talk I gave here earlier. And for more detail, that's on Spiritual Perception as well. We both as well are part of Yaqeen Institute, which is a research institute based in the States as well. So you can see some of our work on Yaqeen as well. But yeah, that's just so that you know who I'm stealing from. Okay, so ideological critique. I mentioned how we were going to be going over figures. So I have a question for you guys. It's up to you at this point. We can, before going into the figures of atheism, we can do a ideological critique, which means conceptually. So rather than go into the figures and their ideas, let's talk about the 2 main arguments that atheists use, and let's kind of deal with it in that particular point. So I can do that now and then go into the figures, or we can go straight into the figures. Who wants to do the ideological critique? Who wants to go straight into the figures? Put them way up. Okay, it's kind of like 70-30, so I apologize for those who want to go straight into the figures. But it won't be too long, inshallah, because the reality is that although there's a lot of hype surrounding the atheist movement and the ideas of the atheist movement, there's not a lot of substance when you look at it to its end. There's a lot of superficial things and a lot of things that kind of make us feel a bit frightened, because they say things like, oh, how do you know if God exists? You can't see him. There's no way to feel him. There's no way to act with him, and things of the problem of evil and whatnot. So basically, there are only 2, all arguments of atheists go back to 2 things. That's it. Just 2 arguments that atheists use. Anything that they'll say will go back to these 2 things. Number 1, there's no evidence for God. And number 2, if there's a merciful God, why does suffering exist? These are the 2 arguments that they use. Now, the first argument is mentioned in the Quran. The first argument is quoted in the Quran. The second one is also mentioned in the Quran.